All right, guys, Murph's here, and today we're going to talk about this. A Remington Model 31L chambered in 16 gauge. Now, when we're talking about this, we're going to talk about a little bit of history. In 1897, Winchester unveiled the 1897 pump-action shotgun designed by John Moses Browning, and this would really bring life to the pump-action shotgun market. And of course, all the other manufacturers needed to be able to compete with this. Remington would make several attempts, but it would be the Winchester Model 12 that would become an even bigger sticking point than the 1897. So like the 1890s, there were some pump-action shotguns that predated the 1897. The 1897 was the first, or the most commercially successful, and then the Winchester Model 12 came along in 1912 and really changed the game in pump-action shotguns at the time. Remington was at that point working on their Model 17. In order to try to better compete with the Model 12, they would come out with this, their first side eject shotgun. Now, just like the Model 12, this would come in many variations with skeet and trap grades and all this kind of stuff, as well as it would be chambered in 12, 16, and 20 gauge. The Model 12 would slightly edge out this shotgun by also being available in 28 gauge. This shotgun, by the way, would come out in 1931, so it would miss World War I and all that kind of stuff. However, it does hold the notable prestige of being the first issued shotgun to the FBI in 1933 after the Kansas City shootout. This shotgun would be available, and specifically the L would start production in 1941, but the shotgun would exist during 1941, and like many 12-gauge repeating shotguns, would get picked up by the United States military for the use of guarding docks, warehouses, rail yards, all that kind of stuff, as well as having a riot gun version that was adopted. However, a trench gun version of the Model 31 was never adopted by the United States military. So that would take up much of Remington's production of the Model 31s and other 12-gauge chambered multi-shot shot or repeating arms up until 1945, where civilian manufacture would resume for pretty much the entire industry. This shotgun would be discontinued in 1949 to be replaced by the Remington 870 in 1950. All right, guys, that pretty much covers history. Now we're getting into features, and this is where some of the, for the most part, whenever it is that we talk about commercial type shotguns, there's not a whole lot of intrigue and all that kind of stuff, but there's some very interesting features to go over on this shotgun. All right, starting off right at the bat, we have a 28-inch barrel. These are made in barrel lengths from 26 to 32 inches. You'll note that we have a singular bead on this particular shotgun, which is my preferred for wing-style shooting. That allows me to be able to remain target-focused at that point. Now, this is a fixed modified choke, and this will be made in a variety of chokes. At this time, with fixed chokes, you had two options in order to be able to have more choke options available. You either had a bunch of barrels or you bought a poly choke. In this case, it's actually very easy to be able to swap out barrels. So we have a thumb screw here that is reverse threaded, and I have to remember that because when I put this barrel back on, I frequently forget that, and then I'm confused for a couple minutes as to why I can't get it off of there or get it back on properly. So you take that screw down. Further, it would appear. Oh, still locked. And then you rotate, we see we have a lug there on the barrel, which is pretty interesting. I actually really like that feature for helping to be able to anchor that barrel into place. And then we also have this nicely threaded portion here that shimmies into the recesses in the chamber. We'll talk about this more here in a minute. So, very quick change barrel system. Now, I really appreciate the system. I think it is very well designed, especially when you take into account some other aspects of it. So, yep. Get this cranked all the way in there. Okay, so we take a look at this Remington 870 Wingmaster chambered in 16 gauge, previously reviewed on the channel, link in the description. In order to be able to take this barrel off, we undo the magazine cap. And now the gun is in three pieces. Now this gives me access to the magazine cap, which I don't have or the magazine tube, which I don't have with the Model 31, but we also run the risk that I might lose the magazine cap. Now, is that very likely to happen? No, not particularly, but this is the time prior to invector choke tube. So if you're shooting like 5-stand or skeet or something along those lines, and you want to get to a different choke for whatever position it is that you're shooting, it would be really nice if everything just stayed with the gun and all you had to do was just swap out the barrel. So I actually really like that design on this particular shotgun. All right, this magazine is capped at 2 rounds. These would also come in a 4-round configuration, but this is more of a sporter type setup. We have a rat tail handguard here for our slide action, which is very thin. And there's a high probability that if you were doing an extensive amount of shooting, your fingers are going to come in contact with this barrel that might be hot at that point. Now, something else to note here in this design is that we have a single action bar. Unlike the dual action bars we have on the Remington 870 and pretty much every modern shotgun. Single action bars are a reliability concern. Not so much in this case, but it is something that if you're trying to get a hold of like a cheap shotgun for your uses, it is something to take into account. You can get cheap shotguns that have dual action bars. I would expect that there are other things that drive you towards wanting to have this shotgun with its single action bar. We'll talk about that more once we get into shooting as well. All right, this being a Model 31L is actually really, this receiver becomes really interesting because this receiver is made out of aluminum. You're telling me that a gun produced in 1941, you know, kind of the midpoint of the production years for this particular shotgun, is utilizing aluminum for the receiver and trigger components. That's a surprise. This is actually very forward thinking. I don't normally associate like firearms and the use of aluminums up until the 50s. So this shotgun is well ahead of its time. And this does result in a very lightweight gun. Like this gun comes in around like 5 pounds. It is very, very light. We'll talk about that more once we get into shooting as well. Now here on the top, we have a little furrow here that is serrated in order to be able to break up glare. I've never noticed glare to be an issue on a shotgun. However, it definitely won't be in this case, I guess. This is a plain barrel. You can get these in like vent rib and solid rib and all that kind of stuff for your trap and skeet requirements. Very important if you're doing like a large volume of shooting, because that stuff's going to also help break up any barrel mirage that might occur in high round count shooting. Just so you know, this is a 1949 produced gun, so this is one of the last guns to come off of the production line for Remington. All right, now, something else that is interesting is that this, of course, being an aluminum receiver, we cannot have lockup occur in the aluminum with the bolt. The bolt's made of steel, and the receiver's made of aluminum, so long-term, that is going to damage the receiver. So instead, this works off of a barrel shank so that the steel bolt can lock into the steel barrel. This is something that we commonly associate with more modern shotguns, namely the Mossberg Model 500, but like the 1200s did this. More modern like editions of the 870 do this type of process. Anything that utilizes an alloy or aluminum receiver utilizes lockup between the barrel, shank, and the bolt itself. But this is very much so forward thinking. I find that very fascinating. In addition to the fact that this bolt arrangement having a carrier very similar to that of what we associate with the Mossberg Model 500, but we could also associate with the Winchester Model 1200, both of which are guns that outdate this by about a decade. Outdate this? Outdate is probably the wrong term to use. They are, like this gun went out of production over a decade before those guns went into production. And yet here it is with those features. It's kind of one of those things, like the more I research into these older shotguns, the more I find that there's not a whole lot new under the sun when it comes to pump action shotguns. All right, our slide release is located at the front of the trigger guard. I actually really like this design. It's kind of, you know, it's very spacious, very easy to get a hold of, as opposed to what we see on the Remington, on the later Remington 870, which is really in the same position. Like these two shotguns very clearly took design cues. Well, this shotgun very clearly took a design cue from the Model 31. And then our safety is located at the rear of the trigger guard. Longtime viewers of the channel know that I'm not a big fan of this. I don't like having to come back and kind of like stack my grip and kind of camp my wrist back here to then wrap up onto the trigger. I would prefer that my safety be where the slide release is so that I can come back onto the trigger. Like slide releases, I'm not as concerned about their placement. It's just a part of the shotgun manual of arms that you got to get used to, but I spend way more time manipulating the safety than I do the slide release. So I would prefer that the safety be more forward mounted. All right, so we have a semi-pistol grip. Long-time viewers of the channel note that I'm a big fan of the semi-pistol grip. It gives me something to be able to pull the gun back into my shoulder with. You'll note that we have a fairly little short length of pull. I'm a big fan of shorter lengths of pulls on shotguns. It makes them very fast to the shoulder, very whippy, and I'm a big fan of that. And then we have the plastic butt pad here. You could get rubber butt pads to be able to swap these out and be able to have something with a little bit more cushion, something that we'll talk about more once we get into shooting. All right, guys, that's features. Why don't we go ahead and talk about shooting? How does it shoot? Okay, so guys, an important thing to note, first off, talk about this with shotguns. A lot of times people talk about shotguns being very heavy recoil, like 12 gauges and stuff like that. I've shot shotguns since I was a kid. I've never, for the most part, been too bothered by the recoil of shotguns. I've spent a lot of time on the trap line shooting box after box after box of 12 gauge, 20 gauge, 16 gauge, 410 through a wide variety of shotguns and a wide variety of weights, double barrels, single shots, all that kind of stuff. The only shotgun that's ever really bothered me with recoil is my 10 gauge. Previously reviewed on the channel, the SBS. Is that what this? I haven't thought about that gun in forever, but regardless, if you're interested in that, go ahead and check out the link in the description. This gun, being as light as it is definitely stout in recoil. Enough so that it kind of bruises or abrades the shoulder. Not so much so that I can't go through an entire shooting session with it. That kind of tells you the dynamic on this particular gun. So I came off of the Benelli M1014 review, which if you're interested in that, go ahead and check out the link in the description, onto this shotgun. So that was a big difference. I ran heavy loads through that M1014 and really did not get bothered by recoil. This thing was stout. Pump action shotgun, super lightweight. That shouldn't be a surprise. So yeah, shooting this was a little bit of a chore. Not so much that I couldn't handle, just something to keep in mind. If you're expecting to do a competitions level of shooting, this gun's gonna beat you up pretty badly during that. I shot 3 different loads through this gun. I shot all high brass, number 8s, number 6s, and number 2s. And overall, I was actually very impressed with the patterning of this shotgun. It patterns pretty tight. Now, of course, with the 28-inch barrel, I'm practically poking the target at any of the close range shooting that I was doing, but that's neither here nor there in this case. This is a very well-balanced shotgun with this kind of very long barrel, but then also kind of short stock, makes it very fast to the shoulder and all that kind of stuff. It would be very quick on a trap line to be able to pick up a target or anything along those lines. So definitely appreciated that handling characteristic with this shotgun. And though I talked a lot about the single slide bar and all that kind of stuff, I've had zero malfunctions with this shotgun. This thing functions very smoothly, very quickly, very reliably. So it's not, there's still a higher possibility of jamming with a single slide bar, but it doesn't make it a requirement. It's not going to happen every time. All right, guys, that's shooting. What are my recommendations when it comes to this particular shotgun? Would I recommend this for duty type use? 16 gauge shotgun with a 28-inch barrel? Absolutely not. Not a duty type gun. At all. Not by any stretch of the imagination. Okay, well, what about, would I recommend this as a home defense, self-defense type gun? If you had nothing else, it would be better than a sharp stick. And if you kind of live on your own and your only requirement in a home defense situation is going to be to just like cover your bedroom door, this shotgun would definitely do it. Though, depending on the size of your bedroom, you might be poking the guy in the chest if he comes through the bedroom door. So this shotgun could work in that type of capacity. This would not be in this configuration, this would not be my first choice for home defense. It's very long, especially if I have to go like secure other family members in the situation of a home invasion or something along those lines. This is not the gun I would necessarily be choosing if I didn't have to. Okay, well, what about as a hunting gun? Let's go ahead and jump to that. I think this shotgun's application for hunting is a little niche. It would not be my first choice for like dove. You know, that early dove season, sitting out there in a field with a couple boxes of shells, like taking pot shots at doves. That's a lot of shooting. The gun's kind of like a little lightweight for that type of application. The gauge is good for it. The gauge, and I think the choking of the shotgun is most definitely where it needs to be for that type of engagement. I just don't think the lightweight really benefits you in this case. This wouldn't be a bad pheasant gun, though I don't love 16 gauge for pheasant. I've hunted pheasant with 16 gauge. You can take pheasant with 16 gauge, but I prefer 12 gauge when it comes to pheasant. This would be a good rabbit gun, you know, working the edge of the fields and all that kind of stuff. The longer barrel is not necessarily going to impact your handling on the edge of a cornfield or, you know, meadow or whatever it is that you're working. And this would be great for covering great distances and taking fewer shots and all that kind of stuff. So good rabbit gun, maybe a little tightly choked for rabbit, but I think it'll get the job done. You'll definitely be able to get good work out of it. Okay, what about as like a duck gun or something along those lines? Trying to track down loads that are actually like approved for waterfowl and all that kind of stuff is going to be pretty difficult in the 16 gauge. So this wouldn't necessarily be my default use. I think I'd sooner see more modern 12 gauge options utilized at that point. And then weight-wise, this would be a great grouse gun. Lengthwise, this is not a good choice necessarily for grouse, depending on where it is that you're working in fields for grouse. So all things to take into account there. Okay, well, what about as a competition gun? Well, if you're talking about like 3-gun, absolutely not. If you're talking about like trap or skeet, still no. Lightweight, doesn't have like a vent rib or anything along those lines. Like you could if you really wanted to, but I would not necessarily default to recommending this option for the type of purpose. So skeet, trap, 5-stand, pretty extensive amounts of shooting, fairly lightweight gun. You may not appreciate it at the end of the day. Okay, well, what about as a truck gun or, you know, farm gun type application, woods gun, if you will? Well, I wouldn't necessarily default to hiking with it. You know, I wouldn't recommend it as a guide gun or anything along those lines. This is not something that I would use to defend whatever patron I have out in the woods. But if you're talking about like throwing this across the back of like some sort of farm or work vehicle, something you're just kind of bebopping around on the property, and you want to be able to take some pot shots at like some squirrels or something along those lines, this wouldn't be a bad choice. But it wouldn't be my first choice for like, I am potentially going to have to defend myself with this gun against be it dangerous prey or people of some sort, poachers or trespassers, you know, someone who doesn't have good intent in their heart. This would not necessarily be the gun that I would recommend for those types of purposes. So maybe less so as a woods gun. All right, what are my uses for this particular shotgun? Honestly, guys, I don't really upland game hunt anymore, so I guess actually have a use for this shotgun other than, once again, with my collection being equal parts practical and museum, this gun has a notable location in that museum. So early, an aluminum designed receiver is incredibly interesting to me, and it's a very noteworthy portion of history to have available on my wall for those types of discussions. All right, what are competitive offerings out on the market? So if we go with current offerings, we're of course going to be talking about a Winchester SXP or a Remington 870, maybe. I don't know. There's been so many issues with Remington and Freedom Arms Group, and now they're both defunct and all that kind of stuff. So I don't know if I would necessarily go that way. But if we go to the time period, what would be, you know, if I'm looking to compete with guns, other options from this time period, what would I look at? Well, of course, the Winchester Model 12, which at some point I will add a Winchester Model 12 to my collection. Just hasn't happened yet. As well as the Ithaca Model 37, which also came in a lightweight setup, very similar to this one, in a 16 gauge, the Sweet 16. So I could definitely see somebody wanting to go with either of those options. I think when we're looking at the lightweight option, the Ithaca 37 featherweight probably better competes with this particular shotgun, but the Model 12 is just such a time-honored and well put together shotgun. So I would not necessarily sideline the Model 12 just based on weight alone. All right, guys. I think this pretty much covers my thoughts on this particular subject. I hope you guys found this interesting. That's pretty much what I got. Have a good day.